I've never seen anything like it. That's a quote from a US soldier. Think about that for a second. This is someone who's seen war, who's been in combat. And even for them, what they saw during the final days of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, well, it was something else entirely. Something on a whole different level of chaos. You probably remember the images, right? They were everywhere in August 2021. Just impossible to forget. People clinging to the sides of military planes as they took off. Massive, desperate crowds crushing against the airport gates. And then that horrific suicide bombing that killed so many Afghans and American service members. It was the brutal, chaotic end to America's longest war, playing out for the whole world to see. So the big question is, how? How did a 20-year war, a massive nation-building project, end like that? In this explainer, we're going to get into it. We'll look at the anatomy of that withdrawal, break down the final chaotic days, and unpack the 2 decades of history that led us right to that moment. Okay, so let's set the scene. The absolute ground zero for all this was one single place, the Kabul airport. For thousands and thousands of desperate people, this wasn't just an airport anymore. It was the only way out, the one and only escape hatch from a country that was literally falling apart before their eyes. You have to understand how fast this happened. The Taliban just rolled into Kabul. There was almost no fight, and the Afghan government, it just evaporated. Poof. The leaders were on planes fleeing the country. So, if you'd worked with the US, or if you were a woman terrified of what was coming next, or really just anyone who wanted a future for their family, that airport became everything, the absolute last hope. And here's the wild thing about the Kabul airlift. It's this total paradox, right? On one hand, it was the largest non-combatant evacuation in US history. They got over 124,000 people out in just a couple of weeks. That's an incredible logistical feat. But at the exact same time, it was happening in the middle of absolute chaos. Just outside the airport walls, it was a scene of pandemonium, violence, and death. So, to really get a handle on why it was so chaotic, you can't just look at those 2 weeks. You have to rewind. We're talking 20 years. How did America's longest war even start? And how did it turn into this giant, unwinnable conflict that led to this exact moment? All right, so here's the super condensed history. It all starts back in the 90s, when the Taliban first took over. Then, of course, 9/11 happens. The US invades because the Taliban were harboring al-Qaeda, and they toppled a regime fast. A decade later, Osama bin Laden is killed, but the war just keeps going. It becomes this grinding stalemate as the Taliban comes back stronger. And that leads us to 2020, when the US finally signs a deal directly with the Taliban, setting a firm deadline to pull all troops out. Now let's talk about the cost of this 20-year war, because the numbers are just mind-blowing. First up, the money. We're talking an estimated $2.3 trillion. And as staggering as that number is, it's nothing compared to the human cost. For the United States, that meant 2,324 military service members killed over those 2 decades. But the heaviest price, by far, was paid by the Afghan people themselves. An estimated 46,319 civilians lost their lives in a war that completely shaped their country for an entire generation. But for all that money, all that military might, the US and its allies could never quite crack one fundamental problem. As one former US advisor put it, the Taliban had an edge. They believed they were fighting foreign invaders on their own soil. They were willing to die for that cause. And the US-backed government forces, they were often seen as corrupt and just didn't have that same level of motivation. And on the battlefield, that belief, that willingness to die for a cause, it made all the difference. Okay, so let's fast forward back to August 2021. With that 20-year history in mind, the final withdrawal deadline is getting closer and closer. But pretty much nobody, and I mean nobody, was ready for just how fast everything was about to unravel. I mean, the gap between what officials were saying and what was happening on the ground was just massive. The prediction was that the Afghan government could hold on for maybe 6 months, maybe even a year after the US left. The White House literally said a total Taliban takeover was not going to happen. But the reality, the government and the entire military collapsed in a matter of days. The whole thing turned into this frantic retreat that was the complete opposite of what they promised. So here's how that final collapse played out. First, the political leaders just bailed. They fled the country. Then the Afghan army, the one the US had spent billions training and equipping, it just crumbled, pretty much without a fight. Right in the middle of all this evacuation chaos, an ISIS-K suicide bomber hits the airport's Abbey Gate. And then, in a truly tragic turn, a U.S. drone strike aimed at stopping another attack mistakenly killed 10 innocent civilians, 7 of them children. It was just one tragedy after another. Let's just pause on that Abbey Gate bombing for a second because it was devastating. It was the deadliest single moment of the entire evacuation. You had an ISIS-K bomber walk into this dense crowd of people, all just desperately waiting to get through the gate, and detonate a vest. The blast killed 13 American service members and a staggering 170 Afghans. It was just a complete massacre. And yet, despite all of that, the initial description from the White House was to call the evacuation an extraordinary success. They were focused on the sheer number of people they got out. As you can imagine, that statement caused a huge controversy because it just didn't line up with the images of chaos and death the rest of the world was seeing. Right. So the last American plane leaves. The war is officially over. But what about the millions of people left behind in Afghanistan? For them, a whole new and frankly terrifying chapter was just getting started. The most immediate and heartbreaking change was what happened to the rights of women and girls. It was like turning back the clock. For 2 decades, they had re-entered public life. They were going to university, they were working as journalists, politicians, you name it. And then almost overnight, it was gone. Girls were banned from most schools after the age of 12. Women were basically told to stop working. Their ability to even travel freely was taken away. All that progress just erased. And it wasn't just about social rights. The entire country plunged into a crisis. The economy went into a total freefall after international aid was cut off and assets were frozen. The UN ended up calling it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Think about that, 97% of the population living in poverty. And to this day, not a single country in the world officially recognizes the Taliban government. They are completely isolated. So that brings us to the big, tough questions at the end of all this. What's the legacy of this 20-year war? And what does that chaotic ending really say about the entire mission? Well, if you look at public opinion in the U.S., there's no easy answer. People are deeply divided. Polls show it's pretty much a 50-50 split on whether going into Afghanistan was a mistake in the first place. After 2 decades, there's just no national consensus. You know, maybe the best summary of this whole contradiction comes from General Mark Milley, America's top military officer at the time. He called the withdrawal a logistical success because, hey, getting that many people out was an incredible feat. But he said it was also a strategic failure. Why? Because the war ended with the exact same group, the Taliban, back in power. And that leaves us with the one huge question that hangs over everything. It's a question soldiers ask, politicians ask, and especially civilians in both the U.S. and Afghanistan ask. After 2 decades, after $2.3 trillion, and after so many lives were lost, the end result looked an awful lot like the beginning. And so you have to ask, for what?